Our final speaker tonight will be Dr. Allyson Mackey. Dr. Mackey received her bachelor's degree from Stanford University and her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. After completing her postdoctoral training at MIT, Dr. Mackey came down to Penn in 2016 to become both an assistant professor of psychology and the director of the Changing Brain Lab. Her research focuses on how children's early experiences, both positive and negative, shape their ability to learn new skills, and her ultimate goal is to promote positive educational and health outcomes for all individuals, regardless of socioeconomic background. Dr. Mackey is also affiliated with the Positive Psychology Center and the Center for Neuroscience and Society here at Penn. Tonight, she joins us to present her talk entitled Working and Learning in 2020, Why It's So Hard to Focus When You're Feeling Stressed. Dr. Mackey, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Okay. Slides okay? All right, I'm sorry?
The slides look good.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the amazing students who organized this. They worked so hard. I've really enjoyed the talk so far, and I am honored to be here. I think our ability to bring you neuroscience in the comfort of your own homes is really one of the bright spots in an otherwise very dark year. And what I'll be talking with you about today is how stress impacts the human brain, both in kids and in adults, and why it makes it so hard for us to work and learn this year. But first, let me tell you a little bit about what my lab studies. So we are interested in the cognitive skills that kids need to learn in school. We're interested in how the brain supports these cognitive skills, how changes in the brain give rise to changes in the mind as kids grow up, as we learn new things. And we're interested in how our experiences shape the brain. So tonight we're very focused on stress, but we are interested in positive experiences too. So effects of learning to read or doing puzzles or going for hikes, some of the things that we can still do in this absolute dumpster fire of a year. So we can talk about that later if you want to know the positive side of these stories. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we study the human brain. So you learn from the other speakers about neurons. Right? You learned how stress can impact the connectivity between neurons and how key that connectivity is. You learned that stress can change the number and the shape of dendrites on cells, changing the cell's opportunities for connections. But all of these processes are very, very small. So they're occurring on the order of 1/10 of a millimeter. And we just don't have that kind of resolution when we study humans. So how do we study connectivity in the human brain? We use a tool called MRI, where we're taking advantage of differences in magnetic property of different kinds of tissues. We mostly study kids, and this is fun for them. They're pretty small. They like the elevator bed going up and down. They like that they get to watch a movie at the back of the scanner. And this mostly works out great, but we need them to be very still to get high resolution images. And they don't always do that. Right, so very best case scenario, we get a resolution of something like 1 millimeter cubed. We call this a voxel or a volume pixel, a three-dimensional pixel, and you can see how the size of this will compare to the scale of the neurons that I just showed you. So voxels are pretty big, but brains are a lot bigger. And so this is a 3D rendering of the human brain. Here's the back, here's the front. The eyeball would be right about here. And your Where's Waldo task is to find that voxel. It's right here. And as we learn more about the organization of the human brain, we see that it's made up of these really big distributed networks. And so we really need to understand the whole brain all at once. And we do that with a technique called resting state functional MRI. And it's called resting state because people are just hanging out in the scanner when we do this. Let me tell you a little bit to give you an intuition of how this works. So here is a cross-section of a 5.5-year-old's brain. It's a cross-section just like this. So this is the top, this is the bottom. And you can imagine a set of neurons over here on the left, sending connections over to these neurons on the right. If they're connected strongly, when these neurons fire, these ones will too. But we can't measure neural firing with MRI. What we can measure is the surge of blood that happens when these neurons are active. And what we see is that when there's a surge of blood here, there is over here as well. And so we see that the blood oxygen time courses are correlated. And the more strongly they're correlated, the more we infer that they're functionally connected. And we can do this for different parts of cortex. And we can also do it between cortex and subcortical structures, like here, the amygdala in white. Okay, so I'm going to use this measure throughout the talk, but I just want to also give you a feeling of why this blood measure is so important. So if you are squeamish or you're eating dinner, please look away. Real human brains are not gray like this brain. They're not rainbow colored like the picture I just showed you. They're pink. And they're pink because they are completely and totally full of blood, right? Blood absolutely everywhere, but is essential for brain function. This is the underside of a human brain with the brainstem right here. The eyeballs would connect here. Your olfactory nerves that would go into your nose are right here. And I would just want you to remember then, when you think about the brain, just how dependent it is on blood flow throughout. Okay, so we've talked about the brain, maybe too much for some of you. Let's talk now about what stress looks like in humans. Right? As was already mentioned tonight, stress experiences vary quite a lot. They vary in severity, in duration, and in timing. So a lot of what we study is the effects of severe early stress, like, for example, an absent caregiver, right, that might last for a really long time during a period when the brain is changing and growing a whole lot. We see lasting effects. You can contrast that with maybe a high-stakes exam that you might take as an adolescent or as an adult, where it feels moderately stressful, but the duration is quite short and it's interacting with a system that's more fully formed. We still don't know what these stresses that we've experienced in 2020 will be like, right? So at the extreme end, we know that people have lost loved ones. We know people have lost jobs. But even the more minor stressors, like maybe the social isolation that's been caused by school closures, might have lasting effects. We really just don't know yet. And so what I'm talking about tonight is really focusing on these early severe stressors in childhood. And then towards the end, I'll talk a little bit also about these kind of big exam-like stressors that we experience as adults. Okay. I'm going to focus on three systems tonight. I'm going to talk about emotion regulation. You may have experienced high levels of stress this year and felt like it is easier to get angry or you cry more quickly at commercials, for example. You might find that it's hard to stay motivated. Or you might find that your attention is scattered, that it's easier to be distracted. Right? And it's one thing to be distracted when you're supposed to be doing your work. Right? It's another thing to be distracted when, for example, you're trying to drive a car. So Philadelphia has seen a 50% uptick in deadly car crashes this year. And so all of these kinds of stressors that we're experiencing individually can create emergent public health crises. And so these are really important experiences. Okay, so let's dive into emotion regulation. And here I want to feature work done by a graduate student in psychology, Anne Park. And she's been interested in how early life stress shapes a circuit between the amygdala here and the medial temporal lobe that processes powerful emotions, and its connections with medial prefrontal cortex that controls the amygdala. And there have been many, many studies now, both in rodent models and in humans, suggesting that early life stress impacts this circuit in adults. Right? And that this circuit can give rise to mental health problems like anxiety and depression. What we didn't know yet was how early these alterations can be detected. When do they begin? And so we collected data on 4 to 7-year-olds, and we asked about their exposure to stressful life events. Those include more moderate stressors like the loss of a pet, up to family illness, loss of a family member, major life disruptions. And what we see when we look at where connectivity of the amygdala tracks with this stress exposure is just a region that's isolated to medial prefrontal cortex. So kids who experience more stressful life events have weaker connectivity between the amygdala and medial prefrontal cortex. And when kids have weaker connectivity here, their parents rate them as having more problems with aggression and more problems with attention. So we're not seeing these anxiety and depression-like symptoms yet in this age range, but it can be really hard for parents to report on those more internal kinds of experiences. Right? So we know that as kids grow up, then they'll start also being at risk for some of these other anxiety and depression-like symptoms as well. And all of these studies now are fitting together with a really clear picture that stress has important impacts on that amygdala to MPFC connection. And so we can see that there's converging evidence from animal models and from what we're seeing in humans, which I think gives us sort of the most certainty that these things are important. Okay, so let's switch gears now to motivation. And this is additional work done by the incredible Anne Park. She's been interested again in how early life stress impacts motivation circuitry. So we know that connections between the ventral tegmental area, which creates dopamine for the brain, with the nucleus accumbens in a more dorsal part of medial prefrontal cortex, we know those connections are important for reward behaviors, and we know that they're very, very sensitive to early life stress. And that alterations here can give rise to mental health symptoms like anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, or symptoms like impulsivity. So these are very important pathways. And there's been some really nice work in rodent models by Kate Penn, who's now at Princeton, showing that you can turn on and off gene expression in the VTA and simultaneously turn on and off the impact of early life stress on these mental health depression-like symptoms. Right? So that gives us this insight that the VTA is really important for this link between early life stress and depression. And so we were curious how the connectivity of VTA in humans, in kids, was impacted by early life stress. So we have a sample that we collected here in Philadelphia where we looked at more severe stressors. Now we're looking at ACEs. You may have heard of these. These are adverse childhood experiences, and they range from sort of family disruption to more severe stressors like abuse and neglect. There's been a lot of interest in ACEs in sort of the broader health literature because experiencing more ACEs as a child puts you at risk not only for mental health problems, but also for problems like cancer and heart disease, right? Really lasting effects here. And she was curious how exposure to ACEs was related to the development of connectivity of the VTA. And what she found was that connectivity between VTA and medial prefrontal cortex looked different in kids who had experienced a lot of stress. And so if we first look at the kids who have no ACE exposure, really low stress in red, between the ages of 4 and 9, you see this really nice positive uptick, stronger and stronger connectivity as kids grow up. If instead we focus on the kids in teal here who have experienced 2 or more ACEs, so they've experienced really high cumulative stress load, what you see is no positive relationship with age. Right? These are cross-sectional data, but they do give us a hint that as kids go through middle childhood, these differences in motivation circuitry emerge. And that makes us wonder if we can intervene early. Before these differences start to pull apart, can we change kids' environments to try to get rid of some of that stress so that these differences never emerge? Okay. So the last system I want to talk about is attention. And now in my poorly done drawings, I'm a neuroscientist and not an artist, you see I flipped the brain. So here I was showing you the brainstem and the medial surface of the brain. Right? When we're talking about emotion regulation and motivation, medial is really about me. Right? So these are processes that are about the self. When you flip to the outside of the brain, you flip to talking about processes about the outside world. Right? So you start talking about lateral prefrontal cortex, lateral parietal cortex for attention to the outside world. And here I want to highlight work by a phenomenal graduate student in my group, Ursula Tooley, who is co-mentored by Danny Bassett, where she's been really interested in how kids' experiences shape the development of their brain networks. So if you remember back to the rainbow brain, Ursula wants to know how those networks get set up and what the impacts of stress might be. And so I'm showing a very brand new result from her work, which I think ties into broader themes here. So she also looked at the same data set of ACEs And what she finds is that kids with more exposure to ACEs have weaker connectivity in this dorsal attention network, right, with hubs on the lateral surface of prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. Okay. We don't know yet how this links up with their cognition or their learning in school, but we have to imagine if you have weaker connectivity in this network, it'll be harder to focus, harder to pay attention in school. Okay. The last study that I'm going to tell you about is not a study that I ran in my lab. Instead, it's a study that I read when I was a graduate student preparing for the most stressful exam of my PhD. And so this is a really beautiful study done by Connor Liston and his colleagues. And he was interested in how acute stress in adulthood affects this circuit, this lateral prefrontal to parietal circuit, and how that gives rise to attention problems. And what he studied were medical students preparing for a high-stakes exam. Okay. What he found is that these students had disconnection between lateral prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex. So this is functional connectivity here. The stress group is in red, have weaker connectivity. And they have worse attention. Right? There's a bigger attention shift cost. What was so elegant about this study is he was able to do the same thing with rodent models. So he'd look at their neurons in prefrontal cortex and see that the dendrites, right, what you need for opportunities for connections, were shrunk. They were smaller in the animals who had been stressed, again in the red bar. And those animals had more trouble with attention. What I think is really key here, though, is that he followed up with these poor medical students 6 weeks after that high-stakes exam, and their brains were basically back to normal. And that gave me so much comfort as I was starting to feel so scrambled after preparing for this really stressful exam that at some point this would be over and my brain would go back to whatever my version of normal was. Okay, so I've been talking about how stress impacts 3 systems, and that we have really good evidence in animal models, in adults, and now in kids about how stress is impacting emotion regulation, the link between amygdala and medial prefrontal cortex, links in the motivation system, in particular between VTA and medial prefrontal cortex. And last, I talked about how stress impacts attention by breaking links between lateral prefrontal and parietal cortex. I sort of look around at the people around me and think about how this year, this pandemic has been impacting these systems. Right? So this year, I don't have to say it, right? It's the worst. And so I see my daughter getting really angry pretty easily. You can see in her poorly written note that I was not allowed to come into her room because she was working. It's possible that she may have heard that somewhere else. Right? Even in students, I see that it's really hard to regulate feelings of anxiety, to stay motivated to do science, and to pay attention. Right? But what gives me comfort is, again, knowing that the human brain is highly plastic. Right? We will get through this. This will be over. Our brains will be able to rebound, and we might even be better able to cope with the everyday stressors that we experience in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allyson, for that amazing talk. So we do have a few questions, and after this question period, we'll go ahead and transition to the panel. So the first question that we got is from Laura Agosto, and Laura asked, is it known if lack of pleasurability and increased impulsivity are correlated or exclusive? So for example, if a kid who presents one or the other.
So I think that there is a movement in psychiatry to think of all of these symptoms as dimensional, right? That every person has some level of these kinds of symptoms, and you might see that they're correlated, but it's not the case that there are clear cutoffs, right? Where you have one or the other. Each person is going to have a different profile, and that's going to inform the kinds of treatments that are most likely to work for them.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Dennis, and Dennis asks, regarding the changing brain and model organism in sex biases, does the attention study address the subject's sex?
Oh, that's very interesting. I know that we see few sex differences in our research because we're studying prepubertal kids. Some of these sex differences may exist and we just are underpowered to find them. I really don't remember if the medical school stress study looked at sex differently, but I do know it was probably a small study. And it's a really important question. I think in our broader discussion, I think Dr. Van Gasser has some ideas about how there are sex differences and stress effects on attention systems.
Thank you. And we do have another question. This question is from Alejandro. And Alejandro is asking, does the same relationship for VTA development hold for ACEs during middle school, say about ages 9 to 12? And when does this relationship start to level off?
That's a really good question, and we want to test it. There's a beautiful data set that's now available to anybody who wants to look at it called the ABCD data set, and they collected data on 10,000 kids starting at age 9, and they're just starting to follow them forward. So we're just starting to see that longitudinal data released as kids start to go through adolescence, and we are very much hoping to test this hypothesis that these VTA differences are going to persist, or even look at what happens when puberty gets added to this picture.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more before we transition into the panel. So the last question, do these sex differences also, oh, I'm sorry.
I think we should bring the panel back up for that question.
Yeah. And do you think the best approaches to normalizing these changes in connectivity will be psychiatry treatment focused? So like medications, brain stimulation, psychedelics, or environment change focused? So school intervention, environment enrichment, etc.
I really think that repairing the effects of the pandemic on kid brain development is going to be an all hands on deck situation. I think we have to think creatively about how we can support parents in the home, how we can bring schools back better, right? Schools, at least in Philadelphia, have been closed, but they were never perfect in the first place, right? I think they can be recreated to prioritize children's mental health. Right? You have to have that socio-emotional well-being in place if you're going to learn math or you're going to learn to read. So I'm hoping that there's going to be some silver linings here where we reprioritize what matters for kids and who is a part of that, right? It's not just parents, it's not just teachers, it's not just doctors. Right? There has to be a way of bringing us all together to talk about what's best for each individual child.